They are leopards and pumas in Britain.
Yes, I suppose because we're an island, they've got no way off. Yeah, they're in our country. They're here to stay.
Seeing is believing, and I have no proof of what I saw that day other than what I can describe. It was huge. It was like the weightlifter of cats.
Welcome to Big Cat Conversations. We speak directly to people who've encountered one of Britain's big cats. We also discuss the bigger picture. I'm Rick Minter, and thanks for joining me. Hello, welcome. This is episode 45 of Big Cat Conversations. Our guests are from Suffolk for this episode, and it's splendid that BBC Radio Suffolk is doing a follow-up to this show. We'll say more about that later, but first let's get straight to our first guest, and he is a journalist and long-time investigator on Big Cat reports in Suffolk, and we welcome Matt Salusbury, and he's going to give us an overview of reports from the county, recent and past. So Matt, hello, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good morning, Rick.
Can we start by asking you how you got into this topic, and when was that?
I seriously got involved around 2014, 2015. At the time, the Centre for Fautuan Zoology were doing a series of books, Mystery Animals of the British Isles. I said, I'll do Mystery Animals of the British Isles, Suffolk. And I expected there'd be one or two big cat sightings to report. I mean, there wasn't much data. There weren't many newspaper reports out there. And very quickly, I found I was deluged with not only newspaper reports, but also I kept getting contacted by people who'd heard about me, who had seen big cats, and just random conversations. I wasn't driving at the time. I would take a taxi, and the taxi driver would say, without mentioning it at all, I saw a black leopard here in 2012. Over time, I've gathered in a region of 150 testimonies, mostly first-hand. The earliest I've heard of was in Rendlesham Forest in 1976 or 77. The thing about Rendlesham, the Rendlesham factor, there was, of course, the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident back on Boxing Day 1980, which is probably the UK's most famous UFO incident. And because of that, there are various people nosing around asking about stuff in the area. So a lot of other testimony comes up. You get people talking about big cats because, let's say, ufologists are asking around and people say, no, I've not seen a UFO, but I've seen a big cat.
Yeah, and isn't it funny that you're looking at one phenomenon and another one crops up, perhaps because people are investigating on a scene, and it does allow people to break cover, or just gossip spreads and other topics come up.
Yeah, indeed. I've also got some testimony from a forester who's now retired, who was active in the 70s, and he said there were several occasions in the early 70s where he was warned by colleagues, if you're working in Hollisey Woods, which is near Felixstowe Ferry, was told if you're working there, look out for big cats, and also Naxton Woods, which is near Ipswich, about the same time, look out for big cats. There are some newspaper reports round about the mid-80s of the odd big cats being seen. What I sometimes get is somebody is describing a big cat that they've seen, and I said, oh, that sounds like a black leopard. I'm careful not to ask leading questions, so I say, tell me about the tail. And then they're describing a leopard, and I'm taking down a testimony. Then they say, but it had pointed ears. I say, okay. And then they're describing something which isn't like a known big cat. I heard in Ufford Golf Course, which is near Woodbridge, somebody saw a black big cat, but it had big tufted ears. And there was this Debenham lion, which is like a small puma, except it's got short ears ending in tufts. I think it's possible that might have been a very early ginger Maine coon cat at the time when they were very rare and unusual and people weren't expecting to see them.
It is interesting, isn't it, when you get those ones which fit perfectly apart from one feature which is really nagging, and it makes you think, often I suspect like you, I don't doubt the whole report. It's just it doesn't tick all the boxes and you think, what's going on here? Is it some kind of adaptation or unusual individual?
Mm-hmm.
We've had ones like that on the podcast from guests and, I've had plenty more myself. Can I ask you about the trend, the proportions of, say, black panther type to sandy brown puma type to lynx type? I mean, we tend to get a fairly consistent pattern of that year on year and region by region and county by county.
I'm getting around about, I would say, 3/4 black leopards. Although most of the accounts I get are historical. It's somebody telling me they saw something a few years ago. And interestingly, often many years later, they're able to recall the year because it made such an impression on them. There was a time when I thought I was getting slightly more pumas than most people who investigate find, although there's the reporting factor, the sort of chance, which leads to me finding out about this anyway.
Yeah, there's so many external factors, aren't there, that come into the recording. You don't know what you're missing. That's the problem.
I think with the fragmentation of the internet now into various proprietary platforms, Facebook and Twitter, it's harder to gather it all together.
Absolutely.
There were pumas, and some of them, including police Freedom of Information Act disclosures, that they had little one-line reports of pumas. They say grey puma, and there's a grey puma in the south of Suffolk. There are sort of one or two chocolate brown pumas. There's also a fairly large proportion of cats where they just said big cat. They didn't know or weren't able to say what they thought it was. I mean, British people aren't particularly good at identifying big cats. The local press tended to report what people have seen as a puma or lynx. Now, they're quite different looking cats.
Yeah.
There's also sort of local lynx clusters. 1997, the local police station got involved, a place called Wrentham. The local farmers were organising lynx patrols because there'd been a lynx and a few chickens, quite a few sightings there. There seems to be a sort of coastal lynx corridor around Wrentham and down to Dunwich Forest. There was a bobcat that was shot and injured near Bury, turned up at a vet's, and its owner was found as of recently at the beginning of the lockdown of 2020. And I've just heard from a news source, a rumour among the shooting fraternity that there was a lynx shot in King's Lynn, trying to find out when, and there was said to be a bobcat shot in Brandon, which is in the north of the county, around just before Thetford Forest begins. There's this persistent rumour of black leopard being shot in North Norfolk in the 90s and buried. That keeps coming up. There's people entirely unconnected with anyone else I've spoken to before in the Suffolk pheasant shooting fraternity who repeat that rumour.
We never know what we're not getting, and we're probably not getting quite a lot of the more significant reports and incidents. And then back to this terminology, lynx and puma. Sometimes people say puma when they mean a black one because they got it in their head that pumas are black. The terms and labels are so difficult for these cats, for individuals and for the media, aren't they? So it's a bit of a minefield. But back to your point about the proportions of pumas or numbers of pumas, the colour, the sandy brown, honey blonde tones of a puma would make it actually quite cryptic in the British landscape. In open fields and mixed countryside backgrounds, the black leopard is going to stand out more. The black leopard's not going to stand out so much in the woodland edge, which it likes, I think, a lot when it's skulking around, stalking for deer. But in many green pastures, the black leopard's going to be much easier to see than a puma. So there may be a proportionately higher base of pumas than we all think from the reports, because some of them are just so difficult to see. They're there, but people are missing them.
Although a lot of reports I get are on roads. I mean, that's partly because it's a sparsely populated county with not many people around, so people are going to be travelling if they see anything.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of people, usually men, who are out very early or late at night for their work. They often see black leopards on the road. I was wondering if the black leopards are sort of hunting around the road because they don't show up against the asphalt surface quite so much.
And there's deer crossings on roads that they might be looking for. I guess also that's where human beings are. We can only get reports where humans congregate and travel through, like golf courses yield reports, or people are on golf courses, whereas the next door bit of countryside might have big cats, but people aren't there so much to see and report them. But I think that's a good point about roads and road verges and road sides. We've had one, where are we? We're now in mid-February as we record this, and the previous week here in Gloucestershire, a highways engineer said he saw one, a black leopard, black panther type, he described it, sitting on the motorway verge watching the traffic. He said just looked up and it was just there very obviously, and he's trained to look on the verges to see what stuff he needs to sort out on the verges, halfway between Gloucester and Bristol, and there it was. And the proportion of lynx, Matt, you said 3/4 black panther, black leopard type, and then how does it go with puma and lynx?
I would say a small percentage of lynx, I'd say a sort of lower single figures percentage, although it seems that there are lynxes in captivity. There was a 2015 Press Association Freedom of Information Act disclosure about licences issued under the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, and some of the district councils responded, and there were quite a lot of lynxes in West Suffolk. And I heard back in the early 2000s in Santon Downer, which is on the edge of Thetton Forest, everybody knew there was the lynx man, kept lynxes, and they could hear the screams. It seems that there was some licensed captive breeding of lynxes going on. Also, when this bobcat was shot and injured near Bury, ended up at the vet, and they very quickly found somebody to foster the bobcat, which suggests that that might be something they've had to do before.
Yes, or people had experience in it.
Yeah.
And of course there was the Beccles lynx, the shot one. That was just over the border, wasn't it? That was in your neighbouring Norfolk.
Shot in Great Witchingham in 1991 and ended up in a freezer in Beccles. The gamekeeper, taxidermist who had it, he told the police were looking for rare birds and searched his house and found it in his freezer. He said that he'd acquired it and had a commission to stuff and mount it for a collector, and a Freedom of Information Act request came out about 2003. DEFRA was then agreed that it was not a native species and he could keep it, and it's said to be on display in a stately home somewhere near Beccles. Now, there are so many stately homes near Beccles that I'm not identifying.
I remember the wonderful quote in the Daily Mail at the time on that story was that the police were at his house doing that investigation, and they said, that's a big freezer you've got in your kitchen. What's in there? And he said, oh, nothing much, only a few pheasants and a lynx.
Yeah.
That led to the photo in the press of it shot on the ground, and that's quite an iconic press report, that one, isn't it? In terms of looking back at the individual reports, could we have a couple of your favourites? Could you select a couple?
It was hard because I have so many favourites. I select one or two. The ones that were just down the road from me, I think, are the most kind of, I wouldn't say alarming, but exciting. Just down the road from where I live, there was this stocky lynx, but with a long tail, that was spotted in Dunwich Forest, chased by a dog. There was a couple walking at a crossroads in the forest. There were big forest tracks there. The husband saw it, the wife didn't, but the dog definitely chased it. There was also, this is one of these sort of tantalising bits of evidence, but very poor evidence. In the 1990s, there was a couple also in Dunwich Forest, a couple from Beccles, who were out walking in the forest, and they heard this growling and panting and were quite scared. I wonder if it's some sort of woodland panic phenomenon that people sometimes get. Except they saw and photographed a footprint, a very big footprint, which has the asymmetrically arranged toes like you'd expect and no claws. A faint photograph, but it's hard to photograph footprints. I also lived in a village called Cheddiston, which was near Halesworth, and one of my neighbours said that she saw, well, clearly a black leopard in a field nearby. Wasn't sure what it was, and only really began to think it was a big cat when one of her neighbours had 2 lambs killed. Everyone thought at the time it was a dog, except it had that characteristic peeled back skin on the bodies, which I believe is the calling card of a big cat. I've had several reports of big cats chasing deer. There's one from a village called Buras, which is on the Essex border. And there were 2 people off-roading, riding I think it must have been the Speedway bike. Speedway is a big thing in Suffolk. They saw a black big cat chasing a deer. There's an awful lot of deer in East Anglia. There's almost a crisis of wildlife management. In some of the nature reserves, it's getting to the point where the deer are threatening to destroy the heather because there are so many of them. Big culls going on, and obviously the big cats follow the deer. In recent years, there have been new varieties of deer arriving in Suffolk. The Chinese water deer came in from Cambridgeshire, and they've now established themselves. They're about the perfect size. They're bigger than a muntjac, but they're the sort of manageable size for a big cat to take down.
It's been put to me that because some people, I think this is less so now, but in past years, as Chinese water deer were establishing in East Anglia, people would have been less familiar with them. They could have been responsible for missed sightings, but of course they haven't got tails, have they, or noticeable tails?
There was several sightings of a, quote, golden puma at West Stow, which is a model reconstructed Anglo-Saxon village and museum in the west of Suffolk. And I talked to the staff there and said, oh, yeah, we heard about that. It's people from outside the east of England who see muntjac deer in the undergrowth and are unfamiliar with them and can't identify their different species of deer.
That triggers the question, looking at your figures, and we all have to do this, I think, as investigators and people who collect reports. What's your judgment on, in your database, how many might be really just mistakes or misidentifications or not big cats, in fact?
I think we are quite poor at working out the size of an unfamiliar animal. There's this theory that because of our evolution, we tend to exaggerate the size because that was a survival trait back when we were prey. But I think particularly people in Britain, where I think we're poor at judging the size of unusual animals we see, which could include a lot of very unusual cats, because I've talked to and visited people who do domestic cat rescue, and there are some really huge feral cats that come in. They're sort of 3 foot long, usually black, full male tomcats. I've seen several that are at least 3 foot long, and there are some quite unusual cats because all the exotic cats that we have as pets, they've got out there into the wild, some of them, injecting exotic genes into the feral cat population.
Yes, exactly.
A farmer who had this intriguing CCTV footage of a strange-looking cat. It looked like, is it a serval? Is it a lynx? There was nothing in the background to identify. There were no features. It was this featureless yard at night with infrared cameras and just some shadows thrown by a fence. And we got a wildlife filmmaker to do some overlays after I was running around in the yard during the daylight with some cutouts. And it was a small domestic cat. It didn't even come to the top of my boots.
I remember that one. Yes, it did fool us initially, didn't it? I think we were open-minded, but we were open to it being big, but it wasn't.
But it was just an unusual shape, There are some really odd domestic cats out there. And I think the tendency is if you see one, particularly in a field, I think that's a real problem. The other problem unique to East Anglia, particularly with historic sightings, is black Shuck, the phantom East Anglian hellhound, a big shiny dog.
This is our words of the week now. Thank you for contributing.
Yeah.
Because it's something which I've always picked up, that the East Anglian sort of big cat and historical origins of the black dog tends to get called black Shuck. I've never understood what Shuck meant. I don't know whether you can enlighten us, but do tell us all about the black Shuck then.
Well, I became interested because, as you say, at the beginning we mentioned ufologists looking for UFO reports and getting big cat sightings. I was absolutely not soliciting reports of black Shuck. Nonetheless, I get the occasional unsolicited report from somebody who says, my dad saw black Shuck in the 70s. And the 70s was the last peak of black Shuck sightings. And then suddenly you go to the big cat. As for the name, we think there's an Anglo-Saxon word sucker, which is demon, but also in dialect of North Suffolk around Lowestoft, a Shuck is a tramp and some kind of trickster. If you look at the reports from the 1920s, or the traditions, I wouldn't call them reports, it changes shape, it explodes, it turns into some sort of calf-like creature, it turns into a donkey, it just vanishes completely in a puff of smoke. The reports that I get of my dad saw Shuck in the 1970s usually are odd and very different, but less kind of supernatural. And the encounter ends with, I didn't know where it went. I couldn't see where it went, rather than it actually vanished. But there are odd reports of it being sort of strangely two-dimensional, or however you walk towards it, it seems to be the same distance away. So it's something very odd.
The overlap time, say in the 70s, it could have been that they were genuine black panthers, black leopard type animals, and the label Black Shuck lived on and was in people's minds, so that's the label they gave it.
Yeah.
So there was a passing of the baton from some kind of mysterious black dog that was in the folklore of East Anglia and passed on to the big cats now. Is it particularly locationally based, or was it all of the East Anglian counties for Black Shuck?
As with fairies and everything else, they're much bigger and scarier in Norfolk. Yeah, they're much more bizarre in Norfolk as well.
Okay.
They're known as the churchyard beast in Suffolk. They do exist in Essex as well, where they tend to explode in old accounts, and you have some in Hertfordshire as well. And I think getting onto the east of England, Lincolnshire as well.
And the other term that the press use quite regularly is a sort of regional label, is fen tiger for Cambridgeshire next door to you.
Yeah, fen tiger comes over into Suffolk. The original fen tiger wasn't a cat. The fen tigers were the human inhabitants of the fens who tenaciously fought against the Dutch engineers who were trying to drain it because they knew they'd lose their traditional privileges, for example, hunting game and fishing for eels and all the rest of it. And they were right, they did. So when around about 1982, as far as I can trace, a big cat started turning up in Cambridgeshire, which is on the western border with Suffolk. And it's a very empty part of Suffolk. You've got the two big RAF, USAF bases. You've got Mildenhall and Lakenheath. Really not much else, pretty much all the way to Cambridge, just fen.
Mm-hmm.
When a big cat started turning up, it became the fen tiger, which is confusing because he's not a tiger. And as I say, the original fen tiger wasn't a cat. You've got this, and there are photos of it from Cambridgeshire. And as I say, there was this kind of slim, long-legged black leopard thing. The police, and particularly the wildlife crime officers in Cambridgeshire, seem to be better resourced, and Cambridge police are on it. Suffolk has the smallest county police force in the UK, so they don't really have the resources. Big cats are no respecters of county lines, so pop into the western edge of Suffolk as well. Like Barton Lodge round there, Red Lodge, Barton Woods, I had fairly recent reports of what seems to be the same animal crossing the border.
I'm going to use this opportunity to mention that I've got a bit of footage which I think is very credible, and it was sent to me by one of the tabloids a few years ago. They just asked me for a comment. They'd had this guy send in his mobile phone footage when he was dog walking in Suffolk. I spoke to you at the time and I said, Matt, I'm really sorry, I've got some bit of footage. It's in the distance, but it's not bad considering. And I can't send it to you because I haven't got permission. It wouldn't be right. The guy doesn't even know I've got it, but this tabloid newspaper, I think it was The Sun, asked me for a view on it before they put it on their website. And I said to them, yeah, as far as I can tell, I genuinely think it's something like a black leopard in the distance, the movement, the form, the behaviour, because it's walking blatantly in a bit of a corridor of land between two fields, and he stops and films it and murmurs to himself, that ain't no moggy, it's something bigger. And you can tell he's emotionally struck by it. And then when it gets out into the field beyond, you can suddenly see how it changes its behaviour and realises, I'm a bit out in the open. And it crouches down and gets all stealthy and sneaks off, and it turns at broadside. The movement and behaviour is very striking and very good to watch. So it's so difficult that I have that on my laptop here. I'll show it to people in the pub. I'll show it to people at rural shows, but I can't sort of release it because I don't know the guy, haven't got permission, and it wouldn't be right. So if that guy listens to this or hears the Radio Suffolk report, it'd be good to hear from him because we could release it to the world if he comes on board and gives permission. As far as I can see, it never got in the papers at the time.
Am I allowed to mention the location?
Yeah, go on then. Yeah.
It was Hintlesham, which is on a quite empty stretch on the road from Ipswich to Sudbury. Subsequent to that, I talked to a licensed deer stalker who said he had definitely seen a black leopard while working in Intlesham. Around about 2012, this subsequently discovered big cat wave I stumbled on. And he had somebody with him who saw it as well.
That's interesting. I didn't know you'd had that happen. And of course, you and I had this phone message from a guy in Ipswich who was out late one night, coming back from a pub or something. He basically said it was quite close to the football ground in Ipswich, which is, reasonably edge of the town centre, isn't it? And I think you were saying if it's credible, it's probably come up the riverside, which the deer do, and come close to Ipswich town centre. Yeah. And he was pointing out that there are vagrant people in the parks in that area of Ipswich, and they better watch out.
He speculated on one of the junkies.
Yes.
I think it might have been a bit of a leg pull. He didn't leave his details. His number wasn't traceable, I understand it. I mean, I had a look at the park, and there is some little river at the back, so it's possible.
It's one of those ones you're dying to follow it up and talk to the guy and suss him out.
You mentioned there needing to be people for sightings. There were 2 big cat waves in Ipswich. Talking to people recently, it's quite common to hear quite a long way into town, see muntjac deer, because there are quite a lot of parks and wooded areas. Some of the first big cat waves that were recorded was one in 1997 or one in 2007 were in Ipswich along the Foxhall Road, which is one of the roads that goes east towards Woodbridge. To be sort of around the Speedway Stadium where there's a lot of greenery, or around playing fields of primary schools and on various bits of heath and parkland. A lot of sightings of a black leopard, to the point where it got a name, Claws, a dismal pun on Jaws. The Ipswich newspaper had a Hunt for Claws competition where they were offering £250 for a photograph, which no one's claimed. And also there were a lot of sightings of a black big cat in the south of the county by the Essex border at about the same time, which isn't far. Ipswich isn't that far from the Essex border. It's possible.
We better hear about your book that's coming out on mysterious Suffolk.
Yes, its full title is Mystery Animals of the British Isles, Suffolk. There is a big series, county by county, the British Isles, so UK and the Republic of Ireland. It's taken 4 years longer than it was supposed to, various family circumstances. But now I've got the opportunity to finish that. It'll hopefully be out sometime this year.
Big cats will feature as a key part of that book, won't they? Big cat reports in Suffolk.
Was going to be everything from, folklore, fairies, black shuck. But very quickly, big cats took over.
Okay.
They are at least a third, almost half of it.
Well, good luck with that. Look forward to seeing it. Radio Suffolk follow-up is probably going to be week of the 1st of March sometime. Anybody who's interested in Suffolk and wants to hear Matt on a feature on Radio Suffolk, we gather, as a follow-up to this, we'll put the link up on our website, and we think that's likely to be during the week of the 1st of March. And what's your view on big cats being in the wild in Britain in general? Have you got what's your sort of attitude to big cats being around and being part of our ecosystem?
There is the escape theory, and somebody contacted the East Anglian Daily Times in 1997 to say he'd released a young male puma. Either it's true or it isn't. But also there's this idea that something's happened to our feral domestic cats and they've gone gigantic. And as I said, some rather big ones have been turning up in cat rescue shelters.
Well, I've seen photos of some, and I've had people report ones which seem to be significantly larger than the norm. Even if we're not expecting it to be a black leopard, it'll still be interesting to see what's in the mix. So I'm with you. I do think there is some kind of mutant moggy that is probably an intermediate size, not capable of killing a deer, but is certainly fox size, a sort of dog fox size, which would throw people. In fact, I had people at rural shows saying, well, I've seen a very big black feral cat, but it wasn't a black panther quite. So I'm with you on that. I have to say I'm not with you on, not fully with you anyway, on people misidentifying size routinely, because there was a very good study done by Exmoor Zoo on this, and I quote it in my book, and they got a sample of people on a day having a very brief look at different scale cut-out models of the different cats in different sizes and colours, and 95% of the sample that day got it right. They actually reported exactly what was there. So that was the best sort of sample, decent sample of that being tested that I know. Okay, it was in bright conditions on flat land. Maybe if these animals are moving and it's foggy or it's low light, we can make mistakes more. But in perfect conditions, that was a good sample, and it actually did suggest that people are more reliable than we might think. My question was also about, what do you feel about black panthers being part of the British ecosystem? Leopards and pumas being present as part of the complement of wildlife in Britain.
I've had several witnesses who've seen a big cat through the sighting of their guns. Most farmers will have a rifle license and a shotgun license, and they had it in their sights and could not bring themselves to shoot it. I think some farmers are not reporting it because they think their more trigger-happy neighbours are going to shoot it.
Yeah.
I've talked to some who are happy to take a little bit of livestock loss because they are awestruck by this animal being around. I think, given the relatively low number of sightings compared to other counties, I think they're passing through Suffolk. I mean, they do roam around. I think a lot of them are just passing through on their way north or west, or the impression I get.
Yeah, you're a bit of a crossroads.
You'll often have a bunch of sightings in Cambridgeshire and then some in Suffolk or in Norfolk. If I've got time, we're talking about big moggies. I've had 2 reports in the 2000s of a Labrador-sized black big cat, one in Beccles in the north by the river, and one by 3 20-somethings walking from Ipswich to a town called Claydon at night. And they describe it as black, bigger than a Labrador, and one of them said it was like a house cat but 5 times the size, and the other said it was definitely like a very, very big cat. And you got a good look at the tail, and the tail tapered in the same way that an ordinary cat does. From their accounts, it seems that there is absolutely huge feral cats out there, possibly.
That's interesting about the tail description, but one might think, well, just because one tiny subtle detail isn't right, the rest of it does fit a black leopard, and maybe it's more likely to be a black leopard, black panther type cat than an enormously large feral.
I think we'd also expect some variation in a very small population with very poor genetic diversity.
I agree with you. In an isolated small population, there are going to be some quirks, surely. Any final point you want to make that you think we haven't covered that you'd like to convey to listeners?
I think that's covered just about everything. Thanks for having me.
Well, great. It's been very good to hear that. Good luck with Radio Suffolk. It's great that they have you as a key contact and you can sort of keep them briefed on the subject. And good for them for having an ongoing interest. I mean, I was on Radio Suffolk last year in 2020 and I was very impressed the way they'd done their homework and the way they'd packaged in some other witness reports. So good to have that interest from a BBC station.
They introduced me as their big cat expert when I'm on there.
Get that book out and we look forward to see it. We'll mention it when it does come out again on the podcast. And if we get the guy giving us permission for that footage in Suffolk, what's the town again?
It's a village of Hintlesham.
Okay, so pass the word out that we want his permission to get his footage out, because I think it'll just be of interest to everyone and they can make their own judgment. So Matt, we'll sign off now and thank you very much for coming on Big Cat Conversations.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Great, all the best. For our next guest, we have John, and John is a landowner based in mid-Suffolk. We are going to be discussing 3 different incidents with John, but we also have a bonus guest because there was a second witness for one of the sightings. So after John, we will finish with Chris, and Chris will give us an extra few minutes on that particular sighting. So first of all, John, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Hello, Rick. Good to be talking to you today.
Okay, John, so tell us about what happened on the very first incident.
Well, basically, Rick, I was camping near Staverton Forest, which is the junction between Wrensham and Hunsrey Forests on the east coast of Suffolk. For friends, we were in this old motocross area that the American Air Force Base of Bentwaters, the servicemen there, used to use. And it closed down a couple of years previous to that, so it was totally overgrown. They had these fantastic tree platforms there that they used to view the motocross, and we were camped out on one of these. And I was just standing there up on the platform, and I saw these two lynx basically bounding into this area of bracken, one after the other. And I was sort of like, Lionel, okay, that's not something you see every day. Turned to my friend Chris and said, I've just seen two lynx run across this area. And he sort of gave me a funny look. Don't think he really believed me. So I climbed down after the tree platform, went around the back of this area of bracken with a large branch and started eating on the bracken, scared them. And they came running out straight in front of Chris, and he had a really good view of them.
And you missed them that second time?
Yes, I didn't see the second time because I was round the back, so I had no view.
Yeah, and great that we'll have him on later on to get his perspective on that and his admission that he didn't believe you first.
Yes.
You were happy to go down and potentially confront two wild animals like lynxes. I guess you wouldn't have confronted and tried to flush out a black panther.
No. If it had been something like that, I would have stayed firmly where I was, Rick, up in the tree, trust me. They actually looked quite playful. I felt no fear whatsoever. It was just tense curiosity. And obviously I was really keen for Chris to see them as well, just to, in a way, consolidate what I'd just actually seen.
When you were down there trying to flush them out, how convinced were you that they were still in there? Could you hear them rustling or anything?
No, I couldn't hear any noise whatsoever, but from the tree platform, when I saw them run in, I could see they hadn't come out of the other side. So I knew they were in there.
What sort of scale would you say they were compared to a dog breed?
Probably sort of spaniel size, small spaniel size. It's difficult to remember, really, because it was such a long time ago. But I remember when I got home after that camping trip, I think one of the first things I did was look up a picture of a lynx, and it was exactly what I saw, basically.
And their mood was just playful, and not acting as predators stalking. They were just interacting and playful, were they?
Absolutely. I mean, one looked like it was almost sort of playfully chasing the other one. I don't know if it was two younger ones or, a male and a female. They were just very playful action, basically. No sort of stalking or anything like that.
Yeah. Did you tell anybody at the time about them?
I don't think I did, actually. I think I maybe mentioned it to one or two people in passing, but I never sort of went out of my way to talk about it.
What was the emotion at the time and on reflection soon afterwards?
Well, I just felt really lucky to have seen them, really, Rick. As I said, it's not something you expect to see, or certainly I didn't at the time, and it was just, I felt quite privileged to have seen them, really.
So, on to the second sighting. That's going back a bit as well, isn't it?
Probably about 4 years, maybe 5 years after the lynx sighting. I was basically lamping rabbits, which I did quite often with a friend of mine on farmlands near Ike, which is not far from Woodbridge, again on the periphery of Huntsville Forest. We basically just walked into this field, obviously it was pitch dark, turned on the lamps, and walking along the ditch line, there was a big sandy cat, sort of puma, basically. We just illuminated it in our lights, probably for about 5 seconds. It's like, bloody hell. Turned the lights off and thought, okay, let's see if we can get closer to it. So we probably walked for about 15, 20 metres towards it, turned the lamps back on, and it had gone. Just no sign of it anywhere. So probably we both viewed it for about, 10 seconds, and we had a really clear view of it.
Turning on those lights and suddenly seeing it was an instant shock.
Yes, it was a bit of a shock. First couple seconds, what's that? So not so much shock. And then, oh, yes, it's that. It's a big cat sort of thing. So, yeah.
Did you know your mountain lions and pumas and cougars at the time, or did you have to go back and look that up, or was it fairly apparent? Did you think, oh, that resembles an American mountain lion sort of thing?
I think it's fairly apparent. I mean, obviously, I've seen these things on documentaries and things like that, wildlife programs. They've got quite a distinctive look. So it was quite plain what it was.
What do you think it was doing?
It didn't look like he's stalking. It was just casually walking along the ditch line.
It wasn't after the same rabbits that you were out to bump off?
Well, we didn't actually see any rabbits in that field. So it's quite possibly scared them away.
Gosh, yeah. What sort of size was that?
Large spaniel, Labrador size. It was dark, so quite difficult to put an exact size to it. But it was getting on to, probably Labrador size, I reckon.
Did you see Any key features, any standout feature that you can remember?
Coloration. I think there was a slight loop to the end of its tail. I can't really recall more than that, to be honest.
Was it helpful having a co-witness again to verify each other's perspective?
Yes, and having a couple of rifles with you is obviously a bit of a safety point as well. Both loaded, ready to go, but obviously shooting it didn't cross our minds. It was just fascination, blimey, let's see if we can get a bit closer sort of thing, have a better look.
On to the next one, and a different cat again.
Yes, a very different cat, Rick. Very different cat. Very impressive. We have a free-range egg enterprise, quite a large flock of birds, so we have a very large shed which is about 120 metres long. And before the birds were out, so I believe it must have been quite early in the morning. It's summertime, so probably maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. I was walking along the shed with the rifle, just having a look out for any predators, because we'd been losing a few chickens. So, I was just checking no foxes or anything like that about.
Mm-hmm.
And probably I got a third way down the shed, and I hear this racket, which is a cock pheasant, basically sort of sounding off. And I noticed it just strutting up and down. And then within about, I suppose, 10 feet of it, 10, 15 feet of it, there's this large black object. And I'm like, blimey, what's that? So I looked through the scope of my rifle, which was 12 times magnification. And this thing was about 75, 80 yards away. So on 12 times magnification, it's the equivalent of standing to about 15 feet away from it. It's absolutely crystal clear. Shock's an understatement. I was absolutely gobsmacked. It was this huge black panther. And I mean, this thing looked like it was on steroids. It's, the bulldog equivalent of the catweld. It was just so muscular. It was basically literally lying on the field margin, so right on the edge of the field, in direct sunlight, looked like it was just sunning itself. It was pretty much ignoring this cock pheasant, which was still strutting up and down and sounding off, very, very close to it. And all it was doing, the end of its tail, just twitching, just swishing the end of its tail. And this thing was just absolutely incredible, Rick. Unless you've seen something like this yourself, you just can't describe it properly. It's just so awe-inspiring almost. And yeah, I I think I must have looked at through the scope for probably a good 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes possibly. Just, observing every detail of it. Its coat was just like shiny black, totally awe-inspiring, absolutely amazing.
Any markings on the coat?
No markings whatsoever. It just looked like this amazing shiny black, almost like it was glowing. I've never seen an animal's coat that shiny before. Absolutely fantastic. And you can see all the muscle tone. Really impressive creature.
And illuminated by the sun as well.
Yep. Illuminated the sun. It looked like it was just sunning itself. Now, I know the cock pheasant sounds a bit weird because I've never seen anything like that before. But about 2-3 years later, I saw a cock pheasant doing exactly the same to a fox. The fox was just lying there, and this cock pheasant was strutting up and down about, again, 10, 15 feet away from it, making a racket. And I really think this is something they do with predators, just to let the predator know, hey, I've seen you, and warn other pheasants as well that this thing's in the area potentially.
Very interesting. But of course, they're very naive to something like a black panther or black leopard because it could swat them instantly pretty much if they needed to and wanted to. But it was in a resting position, was it? It was just totally relaxed and resting, was it?
Oh, yes. The panther was totally relaxed, resting. It was literally almost looked like he was purposely ignoring this cock pheasant. It wasn't even looking at it. But I get the feeling it was a bit frustrated. The end of its tail was, it was agitating, swishing the end of its tail.
Yes, yoga session was being interrupted.
Yeah, basically. Or it might have wanted to eat the pheasant, and the pheasant knew it was there, so it was a bit upset, the whole thing.
Was it a shock to see that animal was sort of out of place as far as you were concerned at the time, because you weren't expecting it, but also sort of at ease on your land in this environment in East Anglia?
It took me probably about 10 seconds to actually accept what it was. I thought, is that a dustbin bag? Is that a dog? It literally took my brain a good 10 seconds to actually comprehend what I was seeing.
And no concern about shooting. You were looking at it through a rifle scope, and that was lovely magnification and amplification, and that was it.
I would have had no thoughts about shooting that under any circumstances, Rick. It was an absolutely amazing creature. If I had been the sort of person that would shoot them like that, it certainly wouldn't have been the .17 rifle that I had. You would want a large caliber rifle. It was a big, powerful animal. Absolutely incredible. I feel really privileged actually to have seen it.
And so it was lying. We've been saying resting, but it was lying. Presumably some things like the tail you wouldn't have seen so well. Is that right?
No, I saw the tail really clearly. It was actually twitching the end of its tail in annoyance to this pheasant. It was perfect view of it. As I said, 12 times magnification through the scope. It was only about 75, 80 yards away, something like that. So it was the equivalent of standing literally just 10 feet away from it.
Any other standout features that were distinctive as far as you can remember?
Just what I said, really. The fact that it was so muscular, coat was so shiny. I've seen pictures or video of things like panthers on wildlife documentaries, but I've never realised just how muscular they were and how powerfully built they were.
Say it had got up and you'd seen it standing broadside. What scale compared to a Labrador do you think it would have been?
It was probably a bit larger than a Labrador. Pretty darn big. Not sort of large Alsatian size, but I'd say very large Labrador size or slightly bigger.
And had you ever had any sense of it before or after on your land or in the neighbourhood?
None whatsoever. I had no idea there was something like that on or around my land. Subsequently, I've spoken to lots of people, including other farmers, who have had similar sightings, quite a few in this area. So I do feel that there is a presence here because other people have seen exactly what I've seen.
And when was that, John?
That would be about 6-7 years ago now, Rick.
And when's the most recent nearby sightings from neighbours or other contacts? Fairly recently?
Yes, there are actually current situations ongoing in our area. The Waving Valley and the Dove Valley seem very active areas. There's another farmer not too far from here who has grainy camera footage of the black panther in his land, and he's apparently seeing it not regularly. He has seen it on several occasions.
And the attitudes vary, do they? Or is there a trend of attitude that you're picking up?
I think the attitudes vary quite a lot. I think the general attitude is obviously shock, seeing something like this. Fascination, that's what I'm getting from a lot of people. But yes, everyone reacts differently, I think.
Do you think it or they are behaving themselves largely and that influences farmers' attitudes, or do you think it's, even if they misbehaved a bit, many people still see them as very charismatic animals?
In East Anglia, we have a huge deer population issue. We have a huge number of muntjac, which are very damaging, and there are lots of other species of deer as well in very large numbers. I think a lot of people would probably say that having a potential predator like this out there, keeping deer numbers lower, is not a bad thing. From what I've heard from people, I believe even yourself, is that they prefer wild prey to domestic livestock. And I certainly know of no issues personally where livestock have been affected.
And your chickens are snaffled by foxes largely, you think?
Foxes shouldn't be a problem anymore because we have quite significant fence. I think the biggest predator issues we have are buzzards, to be honest.
So you are in a rare situation of having seen pretty well all three of the main candidate cats that account for the bulk of sightings across Britain. That is something in itself, isn't it?
Well, it's taken me nearly 30 years to do it, Rick, but...
Yeah. Yes, fair enough. But how does that affect you? How does that influence you and your sort of view of the British countryside and life as a farmer and approaches to wildlife? How does it affect you, having had those experiences?
I think it's been a huge beneficial effect. As of my first sighting, I've taken a really active interest in it. And I just think it's, absolutely incredible that we've got these animals obviously breeding and doing well in our countryside. And I think a lot of people have seen them, but I don't think, many people report them, many people talk about them. I know from a farmer's perspective, I know of other farmers who, oh yes, it's a big cat, but people are aware that these things are about.
It's kept quiet for tactical reasons. They don't want to make a fuss. They don't want bother. They don't want people poking their nose in, all sorts of things. Or they don't want their reputation sort of impacted.
I think you summed it up very well. I think things like that aren't really talked about outside of the circles, certainly not within the farming community. But then again, since my first sighting, and I've spoken to other people and everything else, I have actually spoken to people who said, oh yes, we've seen a big cat, or we think we've seen a big cat, and they haven't reported it. So I don't think many people actually do, to be honest with you.
Sure, no, I think that's quite the case. The problem is we'll never know how many reports we're not getting. Do you think some people are nervous and edgy, if not scared, of having a large carnivore around near their property or on their farm? Or do you think people have accepted that there don't seem to be any risk issues? So with that history, it doesn't affect them. Or do you think some people are a bit on edge?
I think it depends on area. I know there are some farmers, let's say in Wales, for example, who have livestock losses, and that's probably a huge concern to them. But I don't think that's the same issue in this area for whatever reason. I'm certainly not personally scared that they're out there. I think it's quite fantastic they're out there. I can't speak for everyone, but the people that I do know, the vast majority who have had similar sightings, they also think it's quite a good thing they're here as well.
What about people with horses and dogs? If their dogs and horses are spooked and nervous and on edge, do you think that can influence people?
I imagine it would. That's not something I've had personal experience of, but I suppose every situation is different. Every personal experience is going to be different. I think I'll be more scared walking down a dark city street at night than I would be viewing Black Panther, put it that way.
Do you hope to have another sighting in the right circumstances?
I would love another sighting, Rick. I think they're absolutely amazing animals. I feel really privileged I've seen what I have done.
I suppose the final point I want to ask you is the visual you were getting through your rifle scope. Did you give any thought to trying to photograph that, trying to document that somehow? Although presumably it would have been difficult because of the distance and unless you had a zoom camera to hand.
I didn't, but it didn't even cross my mind, Rick. I was just too enthralled by the whole situation. If I had a camera hanging around my neck, I would have even remembered it was there.
And presumably it was too far away for it to zoom in and get a decent image on anyway.
I probably had a camera phone at the time, and in fact I'm sure I would have, but I didn't even think about getting it out of my pocket.
I'm guessing you wouldn't have managed anything other than a blob type of photo.
I think the camera phone, that sort of distance, 70, 80 yards away, I don't think you would see a thing.
Well, let's hope you see it in better circumstances for a photo next time.
That would be nice, but I can't guarantee I'll remember to take one, Rick.
The wow factor will still kick in.
Oh, goodness, it certainly would, yeah.
Yeah, well, great. Thanks ever so much for sharing these experiences.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Rick.
It's just lovely to get a landowner's perspective and hear your view. And yeah, the deer issue, Matt was telling us about the deer populations. I know it's, an issue everywhere in Britain, but it seems East Anglia has got it. It's acute in East Anglia. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we close it? Anything we haven't covered that you wanted to raise?
Not really. I mean, obviously I caught up on your podcast and I think they're fantastic. And, I think it's great that more people are becoming aware of these wonderful animals are out there. And please keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you for being a landowner prepared to come on, because the more landowners, and people from different backgrounds out in the landscape of Britain, the better. To hear different perspectives is so important, and to get different attitudes and different circumstances. And it'll be very interesting to hear if we ever get a witness on who's had 3 sightings, and collectively it's the 3 different cats. I think there are a few people that I know who've had more than 3 sightings because they've dedicated a lot of time to tracking and follow-up. They've made their own luck, and in total they have seen the 3 different cats, but to have three and each time it's been one of the different ones, you're a jammy so-and-so.
I think so too. I've been very lucky.
Okay, we'll get on to Chris and get his perspective. Meanwhile, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me, Rick.
Pleasure. Cheers. We now have Chris as a follow-up guest because he was the co-witness that John mentioned for the lynx incident. Thanks for being our first bonus guest, Chris, and welcome to the show.
You're most welcome. Pleased to contribute.
Okay, and can we hear what happened from your perspective on the viewing platform all those years back?
John's probably mentioned we were both camping out in a site near Staverton Park in a disused motocross area. There are lots of bracken around, stands of trees, young fishery lakes that were still teeming with lots of variety of life, lots of wildlife around, and small copses of hazel and elder around. We'd found an elevated motocross viewing platform which someone had built, which gave us quite a commanding view of the area. Now, John had said that he'd just seen a couple of lynx, and I thought he was pulling my leg, as friends often do, and John... A look came over him and he grabbed a stave from the hazel we'd cut earlier, descended the platform and waded off through the bracken toward this hazel and elder copse, and I had a perfect view from the elevated platform. He was acting as if he was on a sheep beat, so calling and thrashing and smashing the bracken as he moved forward. From the side of this copse, not one, but two lynx or bobcat, I'm not an aficionado enough to identify the exact species, emerged from this copse just out of his sight round the side of the copse. One came out, it moved 6 feet, and then the second one came out, which I was very surprised of. I could quite clearly see the bounding motion and the fact their shoulder blades were articulating in the way cats do. They're quite a similar size to a large lab or a muntjac deer, but you don't get shoulder blade articulation the way cats do in dogs or deer. I don't remember them making any hissing noises or being aggressive or particularly intimidated. They did glance around, but quite quickly and effectively, I would say, they disappeared off the path, away from where John was. The incident probably didn't last very long, but from the elevated view I had, I could clearly see them both and disappear a short way until the undergrowth.
Had they definitely come out because they'd been disturbed by John's attempts to flush them out?
They didn't emerge until he was very close to the copse they were in. If he hadn't have been quite so persistent, you wouldn't have known they were there at all.
How far away from you were they?
Nothing in the way, about 20, 25 metres at most.
In those days, of course, you didn't have mobile phones with cameras on because had you believed that John was genuinely trying to thrash out to wild animals like that, maybe you'd have had your mobile phone at the ready. But A, you didn't necessarily believe him, and B, you didn't have a mobile phone camera, I presume.
Even though I carry a photo-ready mobile phone with me now, I'm not particularly one of these trigger-snappy people that tends to share everything, so it's not my first reflex to grab the phone out. So I probably still wouldn't have taken a photo anyway.
Did you think John was a bit reckless and unwise to go down there close to two wildcats that he assumed were wildcats anyway? I know you didn't believe him at the time, but on reflection, would you have done the same, do you think?
I would have done the same if a friend or John in particular hadn't have believed me, if I'd have said I've seen something. However, John has an advantage in that he's about 6'4" and 17 to 19 stone. So a cat may think twice about that. I'm not quite so large. The copse itself, he approached from one particular side, but they had plenty of escape routes. If the site had been enclosed a bit more in a dell or near a fence line or something else man-made where they would have been potentially felt cornered, I think maybe myself I would have rethought the strategy, but I don't think he was reckless in that. You're out in nature to hopefully be reminded that you're part of a cycle and that life carries on, and being able to witness that, kind of the magic and mystery of it, was fantastic.
John said it was a long time ago and he can't really remember any distinguishing features. I mean, you mentioned the shoulder blades, which is really helpful. Anything else about their form or their movement or their characteristics that you remember at all?
They didn't appear too hurried. I didn't notice a huge amount of speckled colours, mostly sort of the sandy with white. One of the cats, the first one out, did scan around. The second one just followed the first one quite smoothly. Height-wise, they seemed very similar.
Was there any way of telling whether they were naturally wild, whether they were sort of naturalised and had grown up here, or that they might have been recent releases? Did they seem fully wild and confident to you?
They didn't appear too distressed. I think if something had have had contact with humans, maybe it would either been hyper alert and perhaps disappeared quicker, or have been a bit more inquisitive. They wanted to get away. They weren't rushing with it. They weren't overly aggressive. I mean, I've watched a lot of nature documentaries on various big cats and read about them. I'm not personally experienced enough to say they gave away this tendency or this trait in their behaviour to say they were or they weren't.
How does it make you feel? Does it make you feel more alert, and how do you feel about it in general?
To actually see something firsthand, I mean, by their nature, very elusive and very, very secretive. I still feel privileged that I did see them, and hopeful that I will see more.
There's a discussion across Britain at the moment about potentially reintroducing the lynx, if in fact they were lynx and not bobcats. But having seen two together in the wild in Britain, have you got a view on reintroducing lynx?
I would definitely be pro that policy. They'd probably play a big hand in helping keep the rabbit population healthy. When their numbers bloom, they suffer quite terribly from myxomatosis, which is a butchered attempt to try and reduce their population in the past. If their numbers are controlled, they stay healthy. Plenty of game out there. They were a natural species here before they were hunted out. I might just keep an eye on any Jack Russells or smaller dogs I have with me in the future out walking. I'd definitely be pro reintroduction. They would probably need monitoring and possibly some tagging for things they release, just so they can get a clear idea on movements. But yeah, I'd support that policy fully.
Anything else you want to say finally before we close off, Chris? And I'm sorry we're a bit short of time and we've sort of sneaked you in at the end.
I think that more people should have a more of respect for nature, and knowing things are out there that are beyond their normal acceptance, as it were, is only going to add a positive aspect to life. They've not been linked with any harmful attacks on people. They are part of the natural environment. I hope that more people are positive about it and supportive of reintroduction and balancing measures if they are introduced. The landscapers and arborists and estate workers that I do work with through my career, they're much more open about it. They're much more in tune with what goes on. They'd be supportive of any kind of reintroduction measures. They like that whole idea of nature having its way to a degree. A lot more people are respectful of the importance of a natural balance now. I think people on the whole would probably support it.
Great. Well, thank you for playing your part in talking it through on this podcast, because it's a wonderful sighting to have explained. I'm sure listeners will appreciate all of that very much, and thanks for coming on Big Cat Conversations.
All right, thank you. Pleasure.
Before we close, I want to say that we're sorry about the drop in audio quality for some parts of this episode. It's frustrating for all parties, for listeners of course, and especially the guests. We tried different ways to resolve it, but our lines to Suffolk seem to be jinxed, I'm afraid. One additional point to make from Matt is something he uncovered from a recent Freedom of Information request. He's found out that the wandering bobcat that was shot but treated successfully near Bury St Edmunds in March 2020 was one which escaped when it was being loaded onto a vehicle to be rehomed from the private owner to a zoo. So that explains why it was in the local countryside there, sniffing around a chicken shed. Next episode, we move just a few counties west to the English Midlands. We will hear from two different dog walkers, and it's the worried reaction of their dogs that we're going to focus on as a big part of both of those encounters. So, Just a Walk in the Park in Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire is coming next time. Righto, we're signing off for this episode. Thanks again to our guests Matt, John and Chris. Please take care, thank you for listening, and bye for now.